Okay. Chapter 26 of the book of Exodus, we're talking about the tabernacle. God has instructed Moses. God has instructed Moses how to make a tabernacle when he meets with Moses up on the mountain. And last week we talked about in chapter 25 uh, where they get the contributions for the sanctuary, and then God begins this portion of scripture talking about some of the furnishings that are to go into the tabernacle. But chapter 26, he talks about the tabernacle proper. So here is the reason that I ordered these visual aids for everyone. Moreover, you shall make the tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine twined linen and blue and purple and scarlet yarn. You shall make them with cherubim skillfully worked into them. The length of each curtain shall be 28 cubits, and the breadth of each curtain 4 cubits. All the curtains shall be the same size. 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another, and for the other 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another. And you shall make loops of blue on the edge of the outermost curtain in the first set. Likewise, you shall make loops on the edge of the outermost curtain in the second set. 50 loops you shall make on the one curtain, and 50 loops you shall make on the edge of the curtain that is in the socket second set. The loops shall be opposite one another, and you shall make 50 clasps of gold and couple the curtains one to the other with the clasps, so that the tabernacle may be a single whole. Now, how many of us understood much of what I just read? I'll be honest, unless I sit down with a piece of paper and work it out and draw it out and try to figure it out, it makes absolutely no sense to me just to read it, right? This is a portion of scripture that you need to take a lot of time with to understand what is actually being said. Therefore, we got the visual. So open up your visual, and you'll see when you get to this page, you will see that you have a picture, a cutout of the actual tabernacle, and it's got numbers on it, and you can look at those corresponding numbers, and it will explain to you what that piece of the tabernacle is, because that language that we just read in chapter 26 goes on and on and on to describe everything you're seeing here, right? In that archaic language, in that very detailed language, we understand that this is what the tabernacle could have, probably did. There is some debate among scholars whether there was a ridge pole or not. The ridge pole is the pole down the middle, that where a tent slopes. So some think it had a ridge pole, so it was sloping. Some others think that it was like this, was flat topped. I don't know. Flat top will make sense in the desert where there's no rain. Ridge pole helps you to keep the rain off, but I don't know. But I needed you to be able to see that so that you didn't get all caught up in the language. So here is a visual of what it looks like without the cutout. Okay. Now, I'm sorry I couldn't give everybody one of these books, but that would have been very expensive.
Oh, it's nice and warm in here.
Nice and warm. And so, but it's the same thing as you have. You can flip this little cutout thing over. I will also bring this to church Sunday if anybody wants to look at it. So, how many have taken the time to actually look at their pamphlet this past week since you received it?
Mama Nita.
My mom, of course, being the scholar that she is, has read it through and through.
Your mom also has a book.
She has a book. She is on her game, and she's shaming Terry and me.
Oh, so, not really. I just thoroughly enjoyed it. It made it very.
She just was so really enthusiastic. So anyway, thank you for doing that, Pastor.
Oh, yeah. You're very, very welcome. My pleasure. So, okay, I believe we talked last week that God gives them the tabernacle as a teaching tool, correct? First of all, the tabernacle is the dwelling place of God. God is coming to dwell with his people while they travel through the wilderness. 40 years in the wilderness, and God says, build me a place. When he has Moses up on the mountain, build me a place where I can dwell with my people. But there are some requirements for God to be able to dwell with his people. For instance,
sorry.
It's all right. Cheryl was trying to get the old dog up on the bed and she just couldn't jump.
The young dog needs to be home.
How can a holy God dwell with an unholy people? There's the problem that they had in the wilderness. How can a holy God dwell with an unholy people? He had to put in place, or they had to put in place, a dwelling place whereby they could come to meet with God. And the means by which they met with God comes by the gate. For instance, if you look at your thing, it is number 1, right? We got 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D. The gate. This is where they had to approach. And remember, we talked about the gate faced to the east. And if you'll turn over on the back of your pamphlet to this page, let's see, you will see what I talked about. The different tribes had specific places that they camped around the tabernacle, and the tribe of Judah is the center tribe to the east. So to enter the tabernacle, to come before God, you must enter through the tribe of Judah. Who else came through the tribe of Judah? Jesus. Jesus is born from the tribe of Judah. So you must enter the gate, and the white linen curtain fence that surrounds the tabernacle was there to keep the people away from God. There was only one means that God gave them to be able to come into the tabernacle, and that was through the gate. And to come through the gate, they must bring a sacrificial offering to God, right? So the first thing we see inside the tabernacle courtyard is the brazen altar. And the brazen altar, we talked about, this is where God pours his judgment out on that sinless sacrifice, that substitutionary sacrifice. So we understand that it is symbolic of Christ. How do we as post-resurrection believers, how do we come through God? We come through the gate. That's why John writes in his gospel, one of the 7 I am statements of Jesus is, I am the gate. Jesus is alluding to this very gate that you see here. This is the only means of entrance into the tabernacle. The only means of entrance into the tabernacle, where you can see number 15 is the Shekinah glory, the cloud, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. The Shekinah glory of God rested there between the cherubim on the mercy seat, on the Ark of the Covenant. So you must come through the gate, but you cannot come without a sufficient offering, a sufficient covering, atonement for your sinfulness. So the people would bring their offering in to the gate. The priest would lay the hands, or the people would lay their hands on the animal's head while the priest slaughtered the animal, and then it was sacrificed, symbolizing that the judgment of God, the wrath of God, is being poured upon that substitute, so that it wouldn't be poured out on the person. And then the priest would then wash in the basin, number 5, in the bronze laver, and then go into and minister and offer up that sacrifice to God. So the priest would be a stand-in. The priest would be an intermediary between the person who brings the offering and God, right? So my point being, the tabernacle is teaching us how we can approach God, how we should approach God. Okay? The only way we can approach God is through the tribe of Judah, through the eastern gate, and we must approach God bearing a suitable sacrifice, an innocent, a perfect sacrifice. The sacrifices had to be perfect. They had to be the one that was prescribed for that, and then they were good for the day or good for the year. So, question so far about what we see in this picture. So the white linen fence is separating the people from the holiness of God. There is only one open door, and that is the gate. There's only one entrance, the gate. And the first thing that we have to do is come through that innocent sacrifice, and then we are washed by the water of the word. We are washed clean in the water, because as Christians, as post-resurrection believers, we are now initiated into the priesthood. So we are the ones who are to be the intermediaries. We are the ones who are to minister to God and to the people. We're the ones who are to minister to those around us, just as the Levites were to minister to those who were around them, to their fellow Israelites. So now we come through the means of the gate, through the means of the perfect sacrifice, substitutionary atonement, and we are washed clean by the Holy Spirit, and then we are kept clean by these various washings that they needed to do, which is symbolic of our daily washing in the water of the Word, as we understand that. So, questions on the outer courtyard. So what we have in the outer courtyard is the brazen altar and the bronze laver and their attendant forks and fire pans and such as that. So those are the courtyard furnishings. Is everybody clear on what the courtyard furnishings were symbolic of, what their purpose was? The bronze altar, the brazen altar, is symbolic of the cross and Christ's suffering on the cross. And the fact that the grate is midway down in it means that the greatest suffering on the cross was internal to God, or internal to Christ, and not what we see, right? What we see was horrific enough, but the real suffering was internal, where God poured the immensity of his wrath out on his son, so much that his son cries, Father, my God, why have you forsaken me? God, the Father, turned his face away from his son because he couldn't stand to look at him, because he was seeing the sin of mankind, my sin and your sin, that he had placed on his son. So it was my sin that caused the Father to forsake the Son. And as Isaiah tells us in Isaiah 53, it pleased the Father to bruise him. It pleased the Father to punish Christ. And why did it please the Father to punish Christ? Why was the Father happy to punish Christ? Because it was my sin he was punishing. It wasn't Jesus's righteousness he was punishing. It wasn't Jesus's holiness he was punishing. It wasn't Jesus's person he was punishing. He was punishing the sin that was mine, that he had placed on Jesus. That's why it pleased the Father to bruise him, because in bruising Christ, he is in essence bruising me and you. So that's what the brazen altar stands for. And then number 5 in our pictograph here is the brazen, and there's no description of it in the scripture. We don't know how big it is, so this is just an artist's rendering, right? It's made by the women were to give up their bronze mirrors that they had brought out of Egypt, the brass mirrors, and those were hammered into the bronze laver. But that's all we know. So it's got a mirrored like finish, and it was in a bowl shape. That's the entirety of what we know, the instruction that we are given in the scripture itself about that. Moses obviously was shown a picture or a facsimile or whatever you will of it. Moses knew what it was to look like. God had showed him the pattern on the mountain, but he did not record that for us in the scripture. So you'll see that the bronze laver portrayed in a variety of ways, because we just don't know what it was, what it looked like, or how big it was. We just know what it was made of. So questions about those two before we get inside the door?
I have a question.
Yep.
So I understand that the people come in and they bring their sacrifice, and the priests make the sacrifices on behalf of the people, and they're good for whatever. And I know God ordained that through Aaron and the Levites. But if the wash basin symbolizes being covered by Jesus's blood, right?
Uh-huh.
Why can the people not make their own sacrifice? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but there is no more sacrifice.
There's no more now.
Right.
But why wouldn't the people be able to make their own sacrifice to show God that, like, hey,
Well, that's an interesting question, and we could turn over to Numbers chapter 16, and we read about Korah's rebellion. Korah was a Levi, but some of the Reubenites and some of the other leaders of some of the other tribes were jealous of Moses and Aaron because God had picked them, and they led a rebellion. Yeah, that's number 16. Now, Korah and the son of Ishar, son of Kohath, the son of Levi, Dathan, and Abiram, the son of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men, and they rose up before Moses with a number of people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation. But anyhow, basically, we don't want to read that whole thing, but basically what happens, they rise up against Moses and Aaron and say, wait a minute, we're all holy. Why can't we do the things that God has allowed Aaron to do? Right? God had called only Aaron of the Levites and the sons of Aaron to be the actual priest who would go in and minister before him in the tabernacle. Right? The rest of the tribe of Levi was set apart to protect Aaron's and the Aaronic priesthood. They were set apart to take care of the courtyard, to take care of carrying the tabernacle when it moved. They were given specific jobs to do, but they got jealous of Aaron and Moses, and so they rose up against them and said, why not? Why do you get to do these things? Why are you the priest and we can't be the priest? Because we're all holy. We're all chosen by God, so we should all be able to do what God has called you to do. Okay, long story short, God, Moses says, bring your censers here and we'll see who God accepts the fire from. And they did, and God kills them all. Basically sends his fire down to consume them. And then he says to Moses, I want you to have every head of the tribes, the 12 heads of the tribe. I want you to come here, bring them here, and have them bring their staff. And you write their names on their staff, and then you lay their staffs in front of the Ark of the Covenant until the morning, and you will see who I choose to serve me as priest. Okay, then we get to chapter 17, and we see that what happens is, and Aaron, God had told Moses, and you give me Aaron's rod for the tribe of Levi, right? So all the leaders of the other tribes, and then Aaron for the tribe of Levi, and they laid those walking sticks, if you will, down before the altar, or down before the Ark of the Covenant. And in the morning, we say that Aaron's rod budded. Well, it did more than bud. If you'll read it, it began to sprout. It produced buds and flowers and even almonds overnight. So God brought life from death, and by doing so, he proved that Aaron was the one he chose to be a priest before him. The others had not been chosen. They were God's children, but they had not been chosen. And all of that is symbolic, because God wanted them to understand there is only one way, and only one has been chosen. There is only one high priest, in other words. And then we turn to the book of Hebrews, and we see that Jesus is the high priest that supplants the high priesthood of Aaron. So he had just shown the children of Israel, right? There was a rebellion. You can go back and read it. There's like 14,700 or so that died, that God killed during the rebellion. The earth swallows up the leaders of the rebellion, and then the plague breaks out, and Moses sends Aaron out there in the role of high priest to intercede with God on behalf of the people that God was bringing his wrath against. And that is symbolic and a foreshadowing of what Christ would do on our behalf. So that's God's purpose in selecting one single high priest, that there was one single high priest that would come before God, and that high priest, we'll read about it in this pamphlet, only could come into the Holy of Holies one day a year on the Day of Atonement, to come into the very presence of God, to bring a blood sacrifice that covered the sins of the people for that year. But the reason the people could not offer their own sacrifice is because God had told them they couldn't. That's the bottom line answer. But the reason he told them they couldn't is because he chose one, right? And obviously the high priest is a forerunner and a teaching tool, a shadow, a type of the great high priest, which is Christ. And in the book of Hebrews, we understand Christ is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, not after the order of Aaron, because the priesthood of after the order of Melchizedek supersedes and is greater than the priesthood of Aaron. In other words, Jesus is the greater high priest, the great high priest, the greatest, the highest high priest that God has chosen. And Aaron, at the very beginning, was to be a type, a teaching type of the fact that God was going to create one high priest for all time, right? He's going to offer one sacrifice. He was going to give us one high priest. He was going to give us one mediator, and that mediator would make us a kingdom of priests, right? So we see that for instance, Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, when he's ministering right up next to the curtain in the altar of incense, he's offering the morning incense. They would offer incense morning and evening, and it was his time, it was his turn, and most priests would only get maybe one time or one turn to go into the actual temple. In that case, Zechariah in his entire service, because there was a lot of them, but it was his turn, and he was in there offering incense to God when God revealed to him that you're going to give a son, and he is going to be the forerunner of the Messiah, right? John the Baptist, his father is told by God in the temple that he's going to give birth in his old age to John the Baptist, and he laughs, and God shuts his mouth until the child is born. But that we're getting way off track. My point is that the reason the people could not offer their own sacrifice is because God was setting aside a high priest and the sub priest to be the intermediary, to be the people who would minister to the children of Israel. And that relates to us, that God has made us a kingdom of priests so that we can relate, or so that we can minister to the world around us, so that we can be the ones to introduce Christ to the world around us, that we can serve as Christ's hands and his feet around the people where God has placed us. So I hope I didn't confuse you too much. I was getting confused myself.
No, that's good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. We ready to go in the door? So you'll see in 6, we have the entrance to the tabernacle, but you'll notice that there are a lot of layers to the tabernacle itself. The first layer, if you'll see in the cutout, was it was goat's hair. It was very finely woven. It was skillfully decorated. It was beautiful. So the first covering, if you would in the tabernacle and looked up, you saw something very, very beautiful. But then it's covered by goat skin. It's covered by some other skin, right? It's covered by these ordinary plain coverings, and ending up with, the translations are not sure, it's an unknown word, but it's thought it's either badger skin or sea lion skin or even dolphin skin was the final covering. In other words, there was nothing special about the outside. If you looked at the tabernacle, it was not special looking. It was very plain looking. As a matter of fact, it would have looked a lot like their own tents. It would have looked pretty much exactly like their own tents. What do you think that is symbolic of? All of this magnificence that we see inside the tent, because those walls are acacia wood covered in gold, right? You've got the giant candlestick, which again, we do not know the size of it, and I think that's a little big, that what they did here, because that's getting awful close to the roof. So I'm thinking it would have been smaller, but we're not given the dimensions of the candlestick, right? The menorah. We're given the dimensions of the other pieces of the furnishing, but to be honest, I laughed when I saw that. That's comically large to me. But all of this magnificence is contained within this tabernacle. But if you look at the tabernacle from the outside, you see what? You see an ordinary tent. Just like what the people lived in. And that is symbolic, of course, of the glory of God. The hypostatic union is what the theologians call it. The combining of the deity of God with the humanity of Christ. So Jesus is fully God and fully human, but his deity is contained within inside of him while he walks this earth in his humanity, right? On the Mount of Transfiguration, for a brief moment, he reveals just an inkling to his disciples, the 3 disciples who went with him, James, John, and Peter, and they're dumbstruck just seeing a sampling of the glory that was contained within that human flesh that was Christ. This is portrayed by how God has Moses set up the tabernacle. All of this glorious stuff that the people never saw. The ordinary children of Israel, the tribes of Israel, never entered into the tabernacle to view the magnificence of the internals of the tabernacle. All they saw was this ordinary looking tent. That's all they saw when they looked at the tabernacle where God dwelt with them. It's obvious symbology of the fact that God is going to come himself, and he's going to wrap himself in an ordinary human body. Again, going back to Isaiah 53, right? There was no beauty about him that we should desire him. There was nothing special about Christ, about the man Jesus Christ. He was a man walking down the street. He was an ordinary man, right? If we had been around, he's at the marketplace, right? Maybe his mother has sent him down to the marketplace to buy some tofu or something. I don't know, some grain. No, you wouldn't look at him, and the Shekinah glory of God is not shining through him, but the Shekinah glory of God is contained within him. And that's the picture that's being painted with the tabernacle. So, questions about that, the coverings. And I hope you will take the time to read this whole thing. There's a lot of good information here. All right, so we come into the door, and what do we see? That number one, it's separated by the veil. So the Holy of Holies is to the north or the west side. The holy place is east of the Holy of Holies, right? So we come in through the east, and we see the Holy of Holies is closed to us. We cannot enter into the Holy of Holies. Only the high priest goes in there once a year on the Day of Atonement. But what we are told about these furnishings, we are told about the candlestick, it was to be a hammered piece of one piece of gold. So it wasn't pieced together. It was one solid piece of gold, and it was hammered very delicately, very beautifully. Again, I think that's comically large. Maybe they just made it that large so you could see some detail on it. But it was to be to the south side. It was to be on the south wall. The table of showbread was to be on the north wall. And the altar of incense is to be right in front of, in the middle, right in front of the veil that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And obviously, when you go into the veil, to the Holy of Holies, you have the Ark of the Covenant, which contained 3 items. It contained the tablets of the law, it contained a pot of manna, and it contained Aaron's rod that budded. But covering the Ark of the Covenant is the mercy seat, right? It's the literal word, the propitiation or the covering. The atonement that's all the same word. We translate it different ways to give it different, so we can understand differently what it's doing. But propitiation, covering, atonement, mercy seat are all a translation of the very same word, right? It means literally a covering. So the mercy seat is covering the Ark of the Covenant, which is the main thing that is in the Ark is the tablets of the law, right? The other 2 items in the Ark of the Covenant itself stand for Christ, the pot of manna, right? It was to remind them of the bread that God rained down from heaven. When Jesus himself says about himself, I am the true bread that comes down from heaven. So again, Jesus applies to himself these articles and these things in the tabernacle. He's the gate. He means by entrance into the presence of God. He is the living bread that came down from heaven, right? The manna was symbolic of Christ. And then he is Aaron's rod that budded, right? It was a dead rod, right? I got a couple of walking sticks. None of them are going to give me a leaf because they're dead. or dead sticks, right? And wood always symbolically means humanity. So Jesus in his humanity died, but then God brings life from that death. That's why Aaron's rod that budded is in the Ark of the Covenant. And then that is covered by the mercy seat, or the propitiation, or the atonement, right? Remember, same word, the covering. And it's on that atonement, it's on that covering, that the high priest once a year on the day of atonement would come in and sprinkle the blood of the scapegoat, the goat that symbolically took on the sins of the whole nation of Israel for that year, right? It was sacrifice, and that was the blood that the high priest brought in and sprinkled on the mercy seat. So when those cherubim, you can see the cherubim there on the mercy seat, are looking down. They're looking down towards the law, the broken law. We've all broken the law, but what they see instead is that that broken law is covered by the blood. This is why we say that as Christians, and sometimes we make these very familiar sayings, where I'm covered by the blood of Christ. I'm covered by the blood, and we have no idea why we say what we're saying, right? Because the blood is on the covering. The broken law is covered by the propitiation, by the mercy seat, and it is covered with the blood. So when God's avenging angels, when the cherubim, God's means of judgment, are looking at the law that I have broken, that you have broken, it is covered by the blood. That's all symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat. They're not the same thing. They're two different pieces of furniture. God, when you read about God telling them to make it, they're to make an ark, and then they're to make a mercy seat. They're two separate items of furniture that are in the Holy of Holies. Because if the ark was not covered by a mercy seat, God would look down, the cherubim would look down and see the law that everybody had broken. But as it is, they look down and they see the blood covering that broken law. Well, the symbology is obvious, that we are covered by the blood of Christ that God put forward, as John says, as a propitiation. Again, the very same word, as a propitiation, as a covering, as an atonement, as a mercy seat. God put forth Christ to be a propitiation, a covering that comes before God's wrath and my broken law. And he covers it with his own blood. So now when I say I'm covered by the blood, that's what I'm talking about. God no longer sees my broken law. God no longer sees that law within me that I have broken. What he sees is that mercy seat, that blood sprinkled mercy seat. And he knows that I have been covered by the atonement of his son. So that's why he now looks at me as perfect and holy. And when Christ died on the cross, we know what happened in the temple, right? This very same veil rent in two. There was no more separation between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. The way for all of mankind to come into God's presence was now open. Why? Because it wasn't the blood of bulls and goats that are sprinkled on the mercy seat. It's the blood of his precious son. It's the superior blood. Again, we can read all about that in Hebrews, right? It's, if you want to really get a good understanding of Exodus and what specifically what's going on here in chapter 26, I suggest you read Hebrews. Read it in conjunction with this, and it will open this up. It will open your eyes up to this, to what these things mean, as we see the author of Hebrew explain them to us. So, all right. So very quickly, we're not going to talk about the priest, but you'll see on the back, you've got the atonement for sins and the type of sacrifices, the quality of sacrifice and quantity in the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, the Old Testament and New Covenant compared and contrasted, right? Here's the Old Covenant shadow, and here's the New Covenant fulfillment. So that's on the back side of this. And Jen, you did get yours, didn't you? Okay. And then we have a table called the Old Testament symbols of Jesus, and the tabernacle, the high priest, the sacrifice, the ark, contents of the ark, and so on, that help explain to you how every piece of this, every piece of the tabernacle, every piece of furniture, every piece of the high priest, everything models for us and teaches for us Christ. So I do hope you will pay attention to that, and we will talk about the high priest next week, God willing. And if you don't have one, let me know. I have a bunch of them. They'll be at church Sunday, and if you don't live here, let me know and I'll ship you one. And you'll have it before next Wednesday. Comments, questions, concerns? Donald, is that you? Donald Sinkner?